St. Paul writes, God has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of God's beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins. God has rescued us. I have been thinking a lot about rescues this past spring. Our 13-year-old black Labrador Ponyo died 3 months ago. Some of you may remember Pong, or you may remember having heard stories about him. We got Ponyo when I was here at Zion, and he was the absolute worst puppy. Well, maybe not the worst. The same year that we got Ponyo, the book Marley and Me came out. Do you remember that book? Its subtitle was Life and Love with the World's Worst Dog. When Ponyo was being a royal pain in the neck, which happened a lot those first 2 years, I would try to reassure Peter by reminding him that at least we didn't have the world's worst dog. Ponyo ruined us for puppies. We will never get another one, and we are committed to that. But he did turn out to be the world's best dog. And now we can't imagine our lives without one. Peter and I miss Ponyo terribly. The house is so empty without him. Hannah is now afraid to stay home alone at night without a dog by her side. And Sarah has announced in true Sarah form that she is not coming home from school to a house without a dog. And so, since Ponyo died, I have been looking to rescue a dog. We are committed to rescuing this time around, to provide a home and lots of love to a dog who is already here. But I must admit, having never rescued a dog before, despite being a dog person my entire life, I'm a bit nervous about it, a bit concerned. What if the dog has problems? What if the dog has issues? I've never not known my dog from the very beginning. I've never not known my dog's story. I'm a little bit afraid of the unknown and of the risk involved. Have any of you ever rescued an animal? Oh, lots of you. Oh, good, you can talk with me at coffee hour. Maybe in just a word or two, What was that experience like for you to rescue one of God's living creatures?
Bad.
Fabulous? Well, Angela, come on. Of course. How else? What was that experience like for you to rescue?
Just like you, the unknown. Rosie was my first cat, and what is it like having a cat?
Absolutely. And how did it turn out? Pretty good. Thumbs up. Thumbs up. Other experiences. Courtney?
A childhood dream come true.
Oh, a childhood dream come true. I love that. Well, how about this? How about a person? Have you ever rescued a person? There are all kinds of people in our gospel for this morning that need to be rescued. We don't know much about them. We don't know their history. We don't know their stories. We do know that there was a man who was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and that he fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and basically left him for dead. The seriousness of his situation was such that he needed to be rescued literally from death. And all of a sudden, there's a Samaritan coming along the road, and he sees this man who's been beaten in the ditch. Without thinking about the cost, without considering the risk, he dives into the ditch with that injured man. He has compassion for him. He cares for him, and ultimately saves his life. That's the obvious story of rescue in this gospel, right? But I'm going to suggest this morning that there are others in the text who also need to be rescued. The ones we don't pay quite as much attention to as the Samaritan. or the man in the ditch. Who else would you say? Think back over that story that we know so well. Who else would you say needs to be rescued in our gospel? The priest. Why the priest?
He just walked on the other side.
He walked on the other side. Yeah, this is what I love about parables. When Jesus tells a story, a parable, he leaves all of these blank spaces that you and I get to fill in the details. We know that the priest walked by, and we know that the Levite walked by, two people that I kind of expect to stop and care for the man in the ditch. What might they need to be rescued from? What got in their way of them caring and reaching out for a neighbor?
Satan, like the dark side?
The darkness, absolutely. Sinfulness, Jeff?
What about life itself?
Life itself. Sometimes we need to be rescued from our busyness, right? From our blinders. They were on their way to worship. And yet they were so, right, destined to get to where they needed to be, they had to be rescued from their own agenda. Susanna?
Fear of the unknown. They don't know what
Fe-
they're getting into.
Absolutely, fear of the unknown. Sometimes we need to be rescued from the fear of the unknown, from not knowing what could happen, from not knowing who this person might really be. And the lawyer, I'm going to suggest that he needs to be rescued as well. And hard to say this, but I think he needs to be rescued from the law. Because what does Jesus show him in this parable? That the law is limited. The lawyer has a sense that I'm to care for my neighbor, but his understanding of neighbor is very narrow. He needs tunneled. He needs to be rescued from his narrow-mindedness. He even needs to be rescued from the law. Sometimes we need to be rescued from the situations of life. And sometimes we need to be rescued from ourselves. Like the people in the gospel, all of the people in the gospel, have any of you ever needed to be rescued? Yeah, I know that I have. I was stranded one night on a sailboat, a sunfish, in the middle of Barnegat Bay. It was dusk and the wind had come to a complete stop. I was stranded another time on Route 206 headed north when my car decided to come to a complete stop. Each of those times someone came to rescue me and helped me to get safely home. But that's not the kind of rescue that we're talking about this morning. I'm talking about the rescue that the lawyer and the Levite and the priest needed. What have you ever needed to be rescued from? What do you need to be rescued from? What ditch can you not pull yourself out of? What darkness keeps you from seeing God's light? The ditch of despair, fear, self-doubt, the darkness that comes with depression, anxiety, addiction, the ditch of loneliness, grief, guilt. As St. Paul tells us this morning, Jesus Christ has come to rescue us. He writes, God has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of God's beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and forgiveness of sins. Jesus the Christ has rescued us, all of us, from death. Jesus the Christ has rescued us from sin. On the cross, Jesus, without any thought of risk, without any concern for himself, on the cross, Jesus jumps into the ditch with us and pulls us out of the darkness into God's infinite light. And the best part of this good news is this: there is no ditch that Jesus Christ cannot pull us out of. There is no darkness that cannot be shattered by the light of Jesus Christ. Since my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer a little over a year ago, and certainly since her death in September, I keep finding myself in the ditch of grief. And as you know, that ditch is not a one-time shot. On the mornings when I don't want to get out of bed, On the days when I have a difficult time focusing and functioning, in those moments when I wonder how I can ever step back into a pulpit, Jesus shows up and meets me there. He meets me every time in the ditch, in all kinds of people and in all kinds of ways. Like in the encouraging words of an absolute stranger who I met in the bathroom of the intensive care unit. In the compassion of my mother's doctors and nurses. In the grace-filled presence of our pastor. Jesus showed up, and he continues to show up. In the phone calls I get from my oldest and dearest friend, Amy, who still calls me 10 months later to check in on me. In the compassion of my family who has walked this entire journey together as a team. Team Slover, as my dad calls us. In the never-ending patience of my husband, Peter, who always gives me the time and space that I need while making sure that everything in our lives and everything in our home is taken care of. Time and time again, Jesus meets me in the ditch of my grief, and he brings me out into the light. God has rescued me time and time again. God has rescued us from the power of death. God has rescued us from the power of sin. And day after day, God rescues us even from ourselves. God rescues us from our grief. God rescues us from our guilt. God rescues us from our fears and from our self-doubt and from our self-righteousness. There is no ditch that God cannot pull us out of. And there is no darkness that cannot be shattered by God's infinite light. Children of God, you and I have been rescued from, and we have been rescued for. Christ has rescued us for life. Christ has rescued us for service. Christ has rescued us for others. Rescued to dive into the ditches. Rescued to be the light in someone's darkness. Rescued to love as Christ loved us. God has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of God's beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins. God has rescued us. This is the good news of the gospel. God has rescued us from death and rescued us for life. Thanks be to God. Amen.